Hi guys! So last time we talked about those integration runtimes in Data Factory, which basically are compute infrastructure that we use to execute various activities we define in Data Factory. And previously I talked about those two types of runtimes that are basically managed by Microsoft, so it's very easy to start using them. But actually, what about a case where we need to install something on such integration runtime? Let's say some ODBC driver or some client certificate. How to do this? And well, that's the topic for today, so let's get started. Alright, now before we go even further, let's revisit our diagram from the previous episode, because I would like to clarify something. So previously, I talked about those two types of runtimes that I called the first one auto-resolve integration runtime and the second one managed VNet integration runtime. And to be precise, I should call them Azure integration runtimes because that's the official name that is used. So that's Azure integration runtime. And this auto-resolve integration runtime, it was just a name given to this out-of-the-box instance of Azure integration runtime. Likewise is for the second runtime, it is also a Azure integration runtime, but with managed VNet enabled. But it is still a type of Azure integration runtime. So please remember this. Alright, so let's move on to different types of runtimes. So there are two more types that I would like to cover today, and let's start with a simpler one that is called Azure-SSIS integration runtime. So let me write it down. Azure-SSIS integration runtime. And now, if you worked with ETL solutions on premises using SQL Server, then you should be familiar with this SSIS abbreviation. It stands for SQL Server Integration Services. And I like to call it a grandfather of Data Factory because these tools are quite similar, at least conceptually. And basically, SSIS is the way we developed our pipelines, our processes on premises. And now, let's assume that you spent like 3 years developing those SSIS packages on premises, but you would like to migrate to cloud, to Azure. And you don't want to rewrite all those SSIS packages into ADF resources. You would just like to execute them. And yes, it is possible in ADF. We can just take our SSIS packages and execute them. But to make it happen, we've got to use this Azure SSIS integration runtime, which basically is a virtual machine provided by Microsoft that is able to execute our SSIS packages. And that's it. That's the only use case for this type of integration runtime, to execute SSIS packages. So let's move on to the last type, that is the much more interesting than the Azure SSIS one, that is called self-hosted integration runtime. So let me write it down. Self-hosted integration runtime, or it is quite often called SHIR, which stands for self-hosted integration runtime. So how does it work? Well, we again have our subscription. So this is our subscription. Inside which we provision various resources, like previously. So let's say we would have Azure Data Factory. Nothing changes here. Let's say we have our SQL database to which we want to connect in a secure way. But what changes is that this time we've got self-hosted runtime, no longer Azure one. So it is on us to make sure to create this runtime, to provision it, to make sure that it is highly available, that it is updated. So how to do it physically? Well, we've got need to provision a new virtual machine somewhere, let's say in Azure. So this is our virtual machine. Then we would install the self-hosted integration runtime on it, that part of the software that will allow this VM to communicate with Data Factory, and then we'll proceed and do some additional settings to make this connectivity work. Now, when we want to create a virtual machine in Azure, we've got to insert it into some network. So this blue box, it is our VNet. Net we've got to create, VNet and subnet. And please compare it with the Azure integration runtime with managed VNet, where this stuff, creating the virtual machine and the network, was handled by Azure, by Microsoft. We didn't even have to think about it, how to create this. We just wanted to use it. Here, it is totally different. So let's jump into Azure portal and let's start creating those resources. So I will start with virtual machine. So virtual machines, let's create a new one. Let me pick proper resource group. Let me call it IR integration runtime in West Europe. Then I will just make sure that it runs on Windows Server. I will provide an account for the admin. All right. Then I will configure this VM with default settings, which usually is not a good idea, but here I just want to make it fast and simple. So I will open its firewall, let's call it this way, to port 3389, which is used by remote desktop, which basically will allow me to connect to this virtual machine from my machine. In real life, we wouldn't be doing this, most likely. We would need to use some more advanced technique, but here it is fine. Then for networking, as I said, we've got to insert our virtual machine into some network and some subnet. And right now, I don't have any network that I could use. So let me create this new network. Let me call it IR VNet with some default IP ranges and default subnet. Right now, this is fine. And again, in real life, this networking would require a lot of thinking how to organize our subnets and our networks in a way that they won't overlap, that they won't collide. But fortunately, it won't be a task for you as a data engineer. You would have the networking team or the administrating team that you would just ask them to create such a VM. In our case, let's just go with default settings. Let me assign a public IP to this VM, so I will be able to connect to it using remote desktop. Again, it means that this VM will be exposed to the internet. Not a best practice, but here let's do it this way. Let me go to the next settings. Yes, I want to enable auto shutdown, so I won't be paying for this machine if I forget to remove it. And let me just create it. All right. So you should already see that provisioning this self-hosted runtime, it requires more work than the previous ones. But that's the price we have to pay for having the full control over our environment. All right. So while this machine is being created, let's go back to our diagram. So what we are doing right now is to create this virtual machine, right? That is deployed in our subscription. And we also created this virtual network. but that's not enough, right? Because at this moment, once we provision this virtual machine, it would be just a bare Windows Server machine. It won't be able yet to communicate with Data Factory. So what we'll have to do is to install this self-hosted integration runtime on it. Alright, so let's see if our VM has been created. Not yet. Oh, actually it has, right now. So let me go to it. It is running right now. So by the way, take note how fast it was to create a new virtual machine in Azure. Like 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, and it's done, right? Extremely fast. So let me connect to it using a remote desktop. Yes, please, I want to connect. And I will connect using my credentials that we created at the time when this VM was provisioned. And hopefully I didn't make any typo. Actually, I did. Yes, I want to connect. And in a second, I will see the desktop of this newly created Windows Server machine. And then on this VM, we'll proceed to install this self-hosted integration runtime. Let's just wait a second for this machine to start up. And there it is, so we can see the desktop. All right. And let me configure it in a way so that I will be able to download some files using Internet Explorer. But let's give it a second to start. All right, Server Manager is opening. And here I will disable one option that, again, from security point of view, is not recommended, but to make it faster, I want it to be gone. All right, and here in the Server Manager, I will disable Internet Explorer Enhanced Configuration, like this. All right, so now, how to install this self-hosted integration runtime? So let me go into Data Factory to Integration Runtimes tab. And at this moment, we can see those two runtimes of Azure type that we created, that we used previously. The first one is the one that is available out of the box when we create Data Factory. And the second one is the one that we created on our own with this managed virtual network possibilities. But right now, I will create a new runtime, this self-hosted one. Yes, I want it to be self-hosted. Let me give it a name like self-hosted integration runtime. And please create it. All right, and it's done. But at this moment, what we did was to simply create this runtime in Data Factory, but it is not usable yet because we didn't install the software on our virtual machine. And to do this, let me open the link and let me copy it. That will use to download this self-hosted integration runtime software. So right now we are back in our virtual machine. And let me try to browse the website where this runtime can be downloaded from. And for some reason the content is not displayed. It should be here in the middle. So let me simply download a Firefox and I will be back in a second. All right, so in the meantime, I installed Mozilla Firefox, and let me open a page that contains a link that contains this self-hosted runtime to be downloaded. and let me download it. Let me choose the latest version, which is 5.35. Yes, please. And it is about 1 GB of size, this installer. But because the network connection is pretty fast, pretty good, it should be downloaded in like 5 seconds or so. And then we'll install this software, which will finally turn this virtual machine into something that will be usable by Data Factory. Alright, so it has been downloaded. So let me open it and let's start installing this runtime on our virtual machine. Yes, please. And now the installation is pretty simple. I will just go next, next, next using the wizard. There is nothing to be changed here. Yeah, so let's just install it. And now it will take a second or two. So let's get back to our drawing. Alright. So what we did was to provision our virtual machine, and at this moment the self-hosted integration runtime is being installed on the VM. But again, once this runtime will be installed, it won't be usable yet by our instance of Data Factory, because what we'll have to do is to associate or register this runtime with our Data Factory. So we'll need to do this stuff, register it. And we'll do this simply by just grabbing, where is my Firefox? It's here. By grabbing this, one of those authentication keys that are available in our Data Factory. Oh, come on. Let me copy it. And let's go to our virtual machine. So the runtime is still being installed. So let's give it one more minute to finish. And let's jump to the drawing. Alright, so let's assume that we register our runtime and it will be usable finally by Data Factory. That's great. So we'll have the third runtime to choose from. But it won't allow us yet to connect to our SQL database. Because you should remember that there is a firewall in front of our Azure SQL database that blocks access. And previously we blocked the public access, and we want to keep it this way. So let me write it down that, let's say this is the internet that would like to connect to our database using public access or public endpoint of our Azure SQL server. And this traffic is not allowed, it is disabled. Let me just verify that this setting is still on our SQL server. So I'm on our SQL server. Let's go to the networking tab. And yes, public network access is disabled. So the only way to connect to this resource would be to use private connectivity. And so it means that we'll have to create something in a second. Alright, so in the meantime, the runtime has been installed. Great. So what we'll have to do next is to register it with our Data Factory instance. So what I did was to paste this authentication key that I copied from Data Factory, and simply let's click register. That yes, I want to use this runtime with my instance of Data Factory. Alright, and in a second it should be finished. So the setup is not that complex, but basically you as a data engineer, most likely you won't have sufficient permissions to do all of this. and you'll have to reach out to other teams or other team members to support you in this process. All right, so we know that we have to connect somehow in a secure way to our database. And well, how to do this? It's simple. We'll create private endpoint inside our virtual network. So this icon is a private endpoint. We'll configure it in a way that it will point to our SQL server that hosts our database. And then we'll, in our linked service, we'll tell ADF, please use our self-hosted integration runtime. And because this runtime is deployed in the same virtual network as the private endpoint, it should be able to connect just using this private connectivity, completely skipping the public endpoint, which is disabled. All right, so the runtime has been registered and installed. Let us verify this in Data Factory. That yes, we can see the third type of runtime, this self-hosted one, that is up and running. Great. But let me show you quickly that at this moment the connection doesn't work yet because we don't have this private connectivity set up. So let's make sure to connect using self-hosted runtime instead of this auto-resolve one. So this one. Let me pick our instance of SQL database. Let me authenticate in a bad way using SQL credentials, but for now that's fine. And let me test connection. And it should fail, because right now ADF will try to connect using public access, which is disabled, so it won't work. So what we have to do is to go to our SQL server, switch to the private access tab, and right now here we can see the private endpoint that was created from Data Factory, the one that was created, let's say, semi-automatically. And let me create a regular private endpoint, which unfortunately it requires some networking knowledge to do it in a proper way. So let me give it some name, some dummy name. Let's indicate that yes, I wanted this private endpoint to indicate our instance of SQL server. Let me add it to a proper network. And here simply I will just reuse the same network that we used for our runtime, which is the self-hosted integration runtime VNet. And let's add it to our default subnet, which is maybe not the best option, but again, for simplicity, let's do it this way. Now we've got to configure DNS, so the names would be properly resolved. And here I would just click next and just go with default settings. In real life, this stuff is much more complex, and you as a data engineer, most likely you won't have sufficient permissions to do this. But again, for learning purposes, let's just go with defaults. All right, so this private endpoint is being created right now. So let's hop back to the drawing. So what we did. So basically, right now, we've got all parts of the puzzle or pieces created. So we have a Data Factory instance that has access to this newly created self-hosted integration runtime. This runtime was installed on a virtual machine in our network, so it is our task, our job to manage it, to patch it, to update it, to manage access, to make sure that it is available, to pay for it. And inside the same network that our runtime is in, we created this private endpoint, which points to our instance of SQL Server that hosts our database. So now, when we'll try to connect this database from Data Factory, what should happen is like this. So connection from Data Factory would go through self-hosted integration runtime, and because it is in the same network as the private endpoint, it will be able to use it. And then through the private endpoint, we should get a connection to SQL database. So it should work. We'll see in a second once the private endpoint is created. And once while we are still waiting, please think about how much more work this approach requires, especially compared to the managed approach, where most of this is handled by Microsoft. So that's a trade-off, what you want to have or what you have to use. All right, so let's check our private endpoint, and it is still being deployed. So let's we'll get back to it in a second. All right, but how about connectivity to on-premises? Because right now all of this is deployed in Azure, but probably we have some resources in our company network, in some office, in some building. How to connect, how to make ADF able to make this connection. So let's draw this. So let's assume that this blue box, it is our on-premises environment. And let's say that we have some resource here to which we would like to connect from Data Factory. Maybe we've got just SQL Server installed here with some databases. And for some reason, we don't want to, or we can't migrate them to cloud. And probably this SQL Server on premises, well, it's not accessible from the internet because, well, most likely we've got some firewall here that blocks the access. So if you would try to connect from Data Factory just like this, it will fail, obviously. So how to make it work? Well, we can reuse the self-hosted integration runtime option. And we've got two options. The one is to use the same integration runtime that we deployed in Azure, because it is already there. We have full access to it. But to make it work, we would have to connect our networks, our on-premises network and our Azure network, using either ExpressRoute or VPN connection. So our runtime, our virtual machine in Azure, would see the network on premises, and then the connection could be made. And now this connectivity is not in scope of your tasks as a data engineer. The alternative approach, if we don't want to configure this ExpressRoute or VPN, would be simply to provision a virtual machine or regular machine in on-premises environment and install our self-hosted integration runtime there. And because it will be in the same network, then this runtime should have access to the database, to our SQL Server. And then we would just register this runtime with our instance of Data Factory. So we will register it like we did in the case of runtime deployed in Azure. And this connection will work because it will simply go over HTTPS. And this stuff is usually open on the firewall. So this connection should work. Alright, so let's see whether the private endpoint has been created, and that's strange because the status says it has been created, but the icon is that it's not, and the text says that it is in progress. So let's give it a second, and I will be back in a minute or so. Alright, so deployment of our private endpoint is complete. So let's try it out. Let's verify whether a connection this time will work. So I'm back in Data Factory. I didn't change anything here, so we are still connecting through our self-hosted integration runtime. But because this time we have this private endpoint created, the connection should work. And yes, the connection was successful. So this time we are able to connect to our SQL database from Data Factory in a secure way by using the infrastructure that is managed completely by us. Alright, so basically these are the options we have when it comes to integration runtimes. Please note that in case of Azure-SSIS runtime and self-hosted integration runtime, we have to remember about turning off those virtual machines if we don't need them, because as always with virtual machines, we pay for them whether we use them or not, if they are up and running. So to limit costs, it is advised to have some automation that will turn them off. Alright, so to summarize, which runtime should be used where, when, or which criteria should be used to decide which one of them should be used? Well, so let's start with the simplest one. Is our data source or our resource to which we want to connect, is it available publicly without any networking restrictions, without any firewall? If yes, that's great. Simply go with Azure Integration Runtime, the one that is provided out of the box, because it's the simplest one, the cheapest one. You don't have to manage anything here, and you will be able to connect. That's great. But what if our resource is not publicly available and we have to use private endpoints, private connectivity to connect? So here we've got two options. So we can use either Azure Integration Runtime with managed VNet, where we can create those managed private endpoints, which is pretty simple to configure, or we can go with this self-hosted integration runtime approach, when it is on us to deploy and provision and maintain this virtual machine. But in this case, we've got full control over this virtual machine. Then the next criteria might be what maintenance level will satisfy us. Do we want to have to maintain our infrastructure? If no, we don't want to touch it, we don't want to bother about it, then again, the Azure ones are the good candidates. If we are fine with maintaining this runtime, then self-hosted runtime should work. And the final one criteria, I would say, is the control level. What control level do we require on our runtime? Do we need to install anything there? Do we have to configure it in a special way? Do we have to make sure that it uses some static IP address that will be whitelisting on some other resource? If yes, then the self-hosted runtime is the way to go, because here we've got full control. And basically, that's it. So these were the 4 types of integration runtimes we have available in Azure. I hope it was useful. Thanks for watching and take care. See you soon.